They sold her at a livestock auction. Right there between the horses and the cattle, they dragged a woman into the ring with rope on her wrists and a price on her head. Every man in that yard laughed. Every man except one. He was drunk, he was broke, he had no business saving anyone. He could barely save himself. But he said two words that changed everything. Untie her. What happened next didn't just save her life. It burned his world to the ground and rebuilt it from the ashes. This is a story they don't teach in history books. But maybe they should. This story will teach you something the world doesn't want you to know. That the people worth trusting are not the ones who never fail you. They're the ones who fail and then choose to come back. Real strength isn't perfection. It's the decision to stay honest when lying would be easier and to keep building when everything you had just turned to ash. If this story made you feel something, if you felt that cold auction yard, if you held your breath when he shook that hand, then do one thing for me. Hit that like button. It's small, but it tells me these stories matter to you. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have pulled your hand back or would you have taken the deal? Share this with someone who's been knocked down and needs to hear that getting back up is enough. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring that bell. We've got more stories from the frontier that'll stay with you long after the screen goes dark. I'll see you in the next one. A gavel cracked against wood, then laughter. The kind of laughter that comes from men who stopped caring about decency a long time ago. Silas Kane had not been sober at a livestock auction since the year his mother died. Today was no different. Except today they were selling a woman. He stood at the auction rail with a half-empty bottle of rye whiskey tucked inside his coat pocket. His hands were steady enough to bid, but not steady enough to button his shirt straight that morning. He had managed 3 buttons out of 5 before giving up, and the collar sat crooked against his neck like everything else in his life. Crooked, leaning, about to fall if the wind blew wrong. 2 horses went lame in the same week. Both of them, the sorrel mare and the dun gelding, down within days of each other like God himself had decided Silas Kane did not deserve a working ranch. Without horses, he could not move cattle. Without cattle, he could not make the bank payment. Without the bank payment, he would lose the land. And then there would be nothing left of the Kane family but a name on a mailbox and a woman buried on a hill. He scanned the yard through the haze of cheap whiskey and bad sleep. Standard crowd. Ranchers with sunburned necks, traders who smelled like tobacco and cattle grease, a few wives standing near the wagons, holding children by the wrists and pretending not to hear the language coming from the ring. The auctioneer was a man named Phelps who smiled too wide and talked too fast and had the moral compass of a fence post. Silas noticed a man standing apart near the far corner of the yard, too clean. That was the first thing. His boots had no dust on them. His coat was dark and pressed and looked like it had been brushed that morning by someone who was paid to do it. He was writing something in a small leather notebook, but he never raised his hand to bid. Not once. He just stood there watching the crowd the way a hawk watches a field. Patient, precise, interested in movement rather than merchandise. Silas filed it away in the back of his mind and turned his attention to the ring. The auctioneer banged his gavel twice. Next lot. 2 bay geldings. Sound enough if you ain't particular. The horses came through the gate at a reluctant walk, thin, rough-coated, ribs showing through their dull hides like the bars of a cage. But Silas looked past the surface. He looked at their legs, clean. No swelling, no heat, no scarring. He looked at their eyes, clear, alert, tracking the crowd with ears that swiveled and nostrils that flared. These were not broken animals. They were hungry animals, and hunger was something Silas understood. "Bidding starts at $12 for the pair," Phelps called out. "Come on now, gentlemen. Winter ain't buying your hay for you." A hand went up near the front. Then another. 12. 12 and a half. A man in a gray hat called 13. Silas waited. Patience from his father. Stubbornness from his mother. Between those 2 things, he had outlasted better men than anyone standing in this yard. 14, someone said, 14 and a half. The bidding slowed. Ranchers shook their heads. A man near the gate muttered something about grain prices and the railroad, and walked off spitting in the dirt. Silas raised his hand. 15. Phelps pointed at him. 15 from the man in the back. $15 for the pair. Do I hear 16? Silence. Going once. Holt Dawson, his neighbor, leaned against the fence post beside him. Holt was a lean man, with tobacco-stained fingers, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same wood as the fence he was leaning on. "Steal of the century," Holt muttered. "Going twice." Silas kept his eyes forward. Sold. The gavel cracked down hard. Phelps grinned wide and ugly, the kind of smile that meant something unpleasant was coming because men like Phelps never grinned unless someone else was about to suffer for it. He jerked his chin toward the far side of the ring. "And hell, take the woman too, comes with the lot." Silas thought he misheard. Then the laughter started. It came from everywhere, rough and careless. The sound of men who had forgotten what shame felt like. Someone whistled, someone clapped, and beneath all of it, a smaller sound, rope dragging across packed earth. They pulled her into view behind the horses. A woman, bound at the wrists with rope so old and stiff it had darkened to the color of dried blood. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, stained with dirt, and something worse. Her feet were bare. Her hair fell in tangles across her face, hiding everything but her mouth, which was pressed into a line so tight it looked like it had been drawn there with a blade. But she was not still. That was the thing Silas noticed. Every other man in that yard saw a broken woman standing with her head down and her fight gone. Silas saw something else because he was sitting at an angle she had not accounted for, off to the side where the fence curved and the shadow fell long. Her eyes were moving, quick, systematic, scanning every exit, every gate, every gap in the fence. In case she was not defeated, she was counting. A man 2 rails down pushed off the fence and stepped forward. Virgil Creed, big gut hanging over his belt, small eyes set too close in a face that had gone to fat and meanness in equal measure. Creed was the kind of man whose reputation arrived before he did, and whose women stopped appearing at socials after they had been seen with him. Nobody talked about it. Nobody did anything about it either. "I will give you $2 for the trouble," Creed said. His voice was friendly. His eyes were not. They were fixed on the woman with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Silas recognized that look. It came to him, sudden and sharp, like a splinter driven under the nail. His father used to look at his mother that way. After the bottle was empty and the day had gone sour, and something needed to be punished for the way the world refused to cooperate. Silas remembered the sound of it. The kitchen chair scraping back, his mother's quick breath. The thud that followed. He had been 8 years old and had stood in the hallway in his nightshirt, and he had done nothing. He had done nothing because he was 8, and because he was afraid, and because doing nothing was what men in his family had always done best. He was not 8 anymore. "Untie her," Silas said. The yard went quiet. It came out before he thought it through. He was half drunk and fully angry, and the anger was not even about the woman. It was about the bank notice in his pocket, and the empty bottle in his coat, and his mother standing in the kitchen with a bruise on her cheekbone that she told everyone came from a cabinet door. It was about every single time someone should have said stop and did not. The words came out like a reflex, like the kick of a leg when you hit the knee right. Creed looked at him. The friendly smile disappeared. "Now hold on. I said untie her." Silas did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He had his mother's eyes, dark and steady and capable of holding a man in place better than rope. Phelps glanced between them, calculating something. Then he waved his hand. "Cut her loose." A boy stepped forward with a knife and sawed through the rope. It fell away in pieces. The woman's hands dropped to her sides, and she swayed once, just once, before catching herself on the nearest horse. Her fingers wrapped into its mane and held on. "This is foolish, Cain," Creed called after him. "You are taking home a problem you cannot fix." Silas gathered the reins and walked toward the gate. He did not answer. He did not look back. But the woman did not follow him. She stood exactly where she was. Her eyes moved from Silas to Creed to the open gate. She was calculating. Silas could see it plain as weather. She was not choosing between freedom and captivity. She was choosing between two strangers, weighing which one gave her a better chance of surviving the night. She chose Silas, not because he was kind. He could tell that much from the way she looked at him, cool, measured, the look of a woman who had learned to read men the way other people read trail signs. She chose him because he was drunk and sloppy and would be easier to manage than Creed. He saw that calculation in her face, and it did not bother him. He was too drunk to be bothered and too tired to pretend it mattered. The clean-booted man in the corner of the yard folded his notebook shut. He watched the woman follow Silas toward the gate and smiled. Not a big smile, a small, satisfied one. The smile of a man who had just found exactly what he was looking for. They were a quarter-mile down the road before Silas stopped. The dust had thinned. The noise of the auction had faded to nothing but wind and the sound of two horses walking slow. He turned around. She stood 6 feet behind him, arms at her sides, head lowered, waiting. "You do not have to follow me," Silas said. "I did not buy you. You understand that? You are free to go wherever you want." She lifted her head, just enough to look at him through the curtain of dark hair, and when she spoke, her voice was clear, educated, steady, completely different from the mute woman at the auction who had let every man in the yard believe she was nothing. "How far is your ranch from the nearest telegraph office?" Silas stared at her. "Not where can I sleep. Not thank you." Her first question was about communication, about information, about infrastructure. He had the sudden and uncomfortable feeling that he was not the one in control of this situation, that maybe he never had been. "About 11 miles, he said. She nodded once and started walking again. Silas turned his horse back toward home and tried to figure out what exactly he had just brought into his life. He could not figure it. Not yet. Not by a long sight. A door latch clicked shut. Then silence. Then the slow, deliberate counting of footsteps. Ruth Calloway had learned to sleep with one eye on the door when she was 17. She was 23 now, and she had added windows, roof lines, and the exact number of steps between any room and the nearest saddled horse. The bunkhouse was 12 paces from the main house, 40 paces from the barn. 2 windows, both on the south wall, both large enough to climb through if she tucked her shoulders. The door had a latch, but no lock. The walls were thin pine with gaps between the boards wide enough to let in light and sound, and the smell of dust and sage. She counted these things the way other women counted stitches in a quilt, automatically, without thinking. Because thinking took time she might not have if a door opened in the wrong hour. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and listened. Through the wall she could hear Silas moving in the main house, the scrape of a chair, the clink of a bottle against a glass. She had known he was a drinker before they reached the gate. The smell was on him like a second skin, sweet and sour and heavy. The way he held the reins, too tight with his left hand, too loose with his right, the slight unsteadiness when he dismounted. She had catalogued all of it in the first 30 minutes. Alcoholic, lonely, ranch failing. No strong allies that she could see. No wife, no children, no hired hands. Just a man and a bottle and a piece of land that was bleeding out slow. Conclusion: manageable. She hated that word. Hated that it was always the first one that came. But it had kept her alive for 7 months, and she was not ready to stop using it just because it made her feel like her father. She decided before reaching the ranch that she would make herself useful. Fix something visible. Identify a problem he had not noticed. Create the feeling that he needed her, that sending her away would cost him something. It was the same strategy she had used at every camp and every station for the past 7 months. Become indispensable. Become the tool they cannot afford to discard. She remembered the first camp, 3 weeks after her father had her dragged from the house and handed to a cattle driver named Briggs with instructions to take her west and lose her. She had tried to run that first night, got maybe half a mile before two men on horseback caught her and brought her back. Briggs did not say a word. He just hit her once across the face with the flat of his hand and tied her to a wagon wheel until morning. After that, she learned. Do not run. Make them think they need you. A woman who can cook is fed. A woman who can mend harness gets a blanket. A woman who stays quiet and does as she is told gets ignored. And being ignored is the closest thing to safety that a person with no power can reach. She looked around the bunkhouse. There was a stove in the corner, cold. A barrel of water by the door, half full. A shelf with a tin cup and a cracked mirror. And under the bed, something she almost missed. A tin box, small, dented, pushed back against the wall like someone had hidden it there a long time ago and forgotten it, or like someone had put it there deliberately and hoped the right person would find it. Ruth pulled it out and opened it. Inside were letters, a dozen or more, written in a woman's hand. The writing was cramped and shaky, the kind that comes from someone writing by lamplight after a long day of work that left her hands too swollen to hold the pen properly. Each one was signed the same way. M.C. Margaret Kane. Ruth sat on the floor with the box in her lap and read. She read slowly because the handwriting was difficult and because the words themselves were heavy. Margaret Kane had written these letters to no one. They were not addressed. They were not sent. They were the private record of a woman who had no one to tell and who refused to let the truth die with her. This was not an ordinary bunkhouse. This was where Silas's mother had lived during her final months, separated from the main house. Ruth did not yet know why, but she could feel the weight of it in the walls. A woman had suffered here, had written in the dark here, had died close enough to her own kitchen to smell the coffee, and far enough from her own bed to know she had been cast out of something. Ruth set the box down carefully. She would read more later. For now she had a plate of food to eat and a role to play. She ate every scrap, not because it was polite, because she did not know when the next meal would come. She had gone 48 hours without food twice in the past 7 months, and her body had learned to treat every plate like it might be the last. She returned the plate to the main house. Silas stood in the doorway looking at her with an expression she could not immediately catalogue. It was not desire. She knew that look, and this was not it. It was not pity either. She had seen pity plenty of times in the eyes of women at the camps who gave her water and then looked away because helping more would have cost them something. He was looking at her like she was a problem he did not know how to solve. And that somehow was the most honest thing she had encountered in 7 months. A man who admitted, even just with his face, that he was out of his depth. "If you need anything tonight," he said, "blankets, water, just knock." She looked at him a moment longer than she intended, then turned and walked back to the bunkhouse. The door clicked shut behind her. Not a slam, a decision. She slept with her boots on and the window unlatched. Old habits, the kind that keep you alive until they make you crazy. Before dawn, she was up. She found a hammer in the barn, a tin of nails on a shelf, and a corral rail that had been hanging loose since at least spring by the look of the rot around the nail holes. She pulled the old nail, set the rail straight, and drove a new one home with 3 short strikes. She was working on the second rail when Silas came out. He stood at the edge of the corral and watched. He did not tell her to stop. He did not thank her. He just watched with the careful attention of a man trying to decide if what he was seeing was real. "That board has been loose since April," he said. She drove another nail, tested the rail with both hands, moved on. "The bottom hinge on your barn door is rusted through," she said. "It will break within the week." The words came out plain and factual. No performance in them. But something shifted inside her as she said it, and she felt it like a crack in a wall she had built carefully. She cared about this barn door hinge, not as a strategy, not as a tool to make herself useful. She actually cared whether this ranch held together or fell apart. And that feeling unsettled her because it blurred the line between surviving and something else she could not afford to name. Silas was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You talk." "Yes. They said you could not. They said a lot of things." Most of it was wrong. She set the hammer down and turned to face him. She told him what he needed to know. Not everything, just the shape of it. She told him about Mercer Land and Rail, about the company that had been buying up territory across Montana for 2 decades, about the man who ran it. When she said the name Harlan Mercer, Silas's face changed. Not anger. She had expected anger. What she saw instead was fear, raw and sudden and childlike. The fear of a man hearing a name that his mother once told him to run from. "Get off my land," he said. His voice was shaking. "Now." Ruth stood at the gate with her hands at her sides and nowhere in the world to go. The creak of a floorboard under a boot, then the scrape of a tin box being pulled from its hiding place. The last time Silas heard the name Mercer, his mother was alive. She had said it once, standing in the kitchen with a shotgun laid flat across the table, like it was another piece of dinnerware, and she had told him in a voice that left no room for questions. "If that name ever comes to this door, you run. You hear me, son. You run, and you do not come back." He had been 17. He thought she was being dramatic. His mother had always been a fierce woman, prone to statements that sounded like scripture, even when she was talking about the price of flour. But there had been something in her eyes that day that was not fierceness. It was terror. And Silas, being 17 and stupid in the particular way that 17-year-old boys are stupid, had filed it away and forgotten it. He did not forget it now. Standing in the kitchen with Ruth Calloway's voice still ringing in his ears and the name Mercer sitting in his chest like a swallowed stone, he remembered his mother's face and understood for the first time that she had not been dramatic. She had been trying to save his life. He poured whiskey. The bottle was nearly empty. He had been working on it since Tuesday, and it was now Thursday, and there was maybe one good drink left in it. He stared at the glass. Then he looked through the window at Ruth, still standing at the gate, still not moving. Her fingers wrapped around the fence post so tight that even from the kitchen he could see the white of her knuckles. She had nowhere to go. He knew that. He could see it in the way she stood. Not defiant, not proud. Just anchored to the only solid thing within reach, because the alternative was open road in every direction, and not a single safe place at the end of any of them. Silas looked at the whiskey, looked at her, poured the whiskey down the sink and watched it swirl and disappear. He went to the bedroom, knelt beside the bed, and reached into the darkness beneath it, where dust and memory collected in equal measure. His hand found the tin box. Same as the one Ruth had found in the bunkhouse, but this one was his. His mother had kept 2. One for the letters she wrote to herself. One for the letters she wrote to him. He had never opened it. 5 years she had been dead. And he had never once lifted that lid because he was afraid of what was inside. Not afraid of the words. Afraid of what they would make him feel. Because feeling things was what the whiskey was for. And if he opened the box, he would have to feel them sober, and he was not sure he could survive that. He carried the box outside. Ruth saw him coming, and something shifted in her face. Not hope. Something more cautious than hope. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone who understands that the next 5 minutes are going to change everything. He sat on the porch step. She walked from the gate and sat on the ground facing him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then he opened the box. Margaret Kane's handwriting filled the pages. Small, cramped. The letters pressed hard into the paper like she was trying to carve them there permanently. Silas read slowly. His mother had written everything. Not a diary exactly. More like a case file. Dates, names, amounts. The slow, methodical record of a woman who knew she was being destroyed and was determined to document every blow. Mercer Land and Rail acquired the Sutter property in 1872 through a fraudulent survey filed by Gerald Haynes. Original markers removed, new markers placed 30 yards south. Tom Sutter protested. 3 months later, Tom Sutter was dead. James Polk refused to sell his freight line. Wagon went off a cliff on the Helena Road, ruled an accident. Mercer acquired the route within the month. The pages went on. Ranch after ranch, family after family. A map of destruction drawn in his mother's hand. But then the pages changed. The handwriting got smaller, tighter, as if Margaret was pressing the pen harder because what she was writing cost her something to put down. Elias knew. 2 words. Silas read them and felt the ground shift under him. Elias knew about the cattle before it happened. A man came in October, name of Briggs, and told him straight, "Sell the south pasture or lose the herd." Elias refused to sell. But he did not move the cattle either. He did not warn anyone. He sat in this house and he drank and he waited for it to happen because he had already given up. Silas turned the page with hands that had gone numb. There is more. And it is worse. Elias took money from Mercer, a loan. 2 years before the cattle died. $300 to cover gambling debts I did not know he had. When he could not repay, Mercer took the south pasture. The cattle poisoning was not theft, it was punishment. Elias tried to report Mercer to the marshal after he had already taken the money, and Mercer made him pay for that betrayal with 40 dead animals and a broken man. I found the loan papers after Elias died. They were hidden in the bottom of his toolbox, wrapped in oilcloth. He signed them, his name, his hand. He made a deal with the man who destroyed us, and then he tried to undo it when his conscience woke up, and by then, it was too late. I cannot sleep in this house anymore. I cannot lie in the bed where he lay and made that decision. I am moving to the bunkhouse. Silas will not understand. But I would rather he think I am strange than know what his father did. Silas closed the journal. The world was very still. A meadowlark sang somewhere in the grass, and it sounded obscene that a bird could sing while everything he had ever believed about his family was turning to ash in his hands. His father was not a victim, not purely. He was a weak man who had made a deal with the devil because his debts were eating him alive and his pride would not let him tell his wife. He had tried to back out when the weight of what he had done became too heavy and the devil had punished him for it. And Margaret, who had not made the deal, who had not known about the loan, who had not gambled or drunk or surrendered, Margaret was the one who paid. She worked herself into a grave at 42 because her husband's secret had turned their ranch into a prison. Silas looked at his own hands, the calluses, the cracked knuckles, the faint tremor that never quite went away anymore. He saw his father in those hands, the drinking, the running away. After the funeral he had left, hired out to a ranch in Wyoming for 2 years, fought, drank, let the ranch go to seed because coming home meant facing what was there. And what was there was a bunkhouse where his mother had died alone and a main house full of a dead man's lies. He was more like his father than he had ever wanted to admit. The bottle, the avoidance, the talent for letting things rot while pretending he was just waiting for the right time to fix them. Ruth had been sitting quietly through all of it. She had not tried to read over his shoulder. She had not asked questions. She had simply waited, the way a person waits who understands that some silences need to be endured rather than filled. "My mother kept a journal," Silas said. His voice sounded far away, even to his own ears. "She wrote down everything Mercer did to the ranches around here, every survey they moved, every family they broke, every man who fought back and lost. She also wrote about my father." He told Ruth what the journal said. He did not soften it. He did not explain it away. He said it flat and plain because that was the only way he could say it without the words catching in his throat and choking him. When he finished, Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that he did not expect. "Margaret saw me once, when I was a girl." He looked at her. Ruth opened the journal to a passage near the back. Margaret's handwriting, shaky but clear. "Saw the Mercer girl in town today. A child with sad eyes who flinched when her father touched her shoulder. Something is wrong in that house. I can see it the way you can see rot in a fence post before it breaks. On the surface, everything is straight and painted and proper, but underneath it is hollow." Ruth closed the journal. Your mother saw me when I was 10 years old. She saw what no one else bothered to look for. And she wrote it down because that is what she did. She wrote things down so they would not disappear. Silas took the journal back, held it in both hands like it was something alive, something that still had warmth. My mother left a note at the end, he said. Last page. She wrote it the week she died, I think, judging by how bad the handwriting had gotten. He turned to the final page and read aloud. If someone ever comes with proof against Mercer, do not let them go. That is the only chance. I waited my whole life for that person. They never came. But maybe they will come for you, Silas. And if they do, hold on to them, whatever it costs. He looked up at Ruth. She met his eyes. Steady. Waiting. I do not trust you, he said. And I do not much like you either. But my mother asked me to do one thing. And I have not done a single thing she asked since I was 19 years old, so you can stay. It was not noble. It was not romantic. It was a man keeping a promise to a dead woman because he had broken every other promise he had ever made, and this was the last one left. Ruth nodded once. That is honest, she said. I can work with honest. She stood up and brushed the dirt from her skirt and went to the bunkhouse. The door clicked shut behind her. That quiet, firm click that was becoming familiar. A woman making decisions in the only space available to her. Silas sat on the porch with his mother's journal in his hands and tried to rearrange everything he knew about his life into a shape that made sense. It did not work. But he sat there anyway, because sitting with the truth was better than running from it, and that was the most progress he had made in 5 years. Late in the afternoon, the sound of hoofbeats reached him from the road. 2 horses, moving fast. Silas stood and put his hand on the rifle that leaned against the porch railing. Holt Dawson came over the ridge first. Behind him, riding a gray mare that was too fine for this country, was a young woman, 19 maybe. Dark hair pinned back, wearing a traveling dress that was dusty but expensive. She was crying. Ruth came out of the bunkhouse at the sound. She looked at the young woman and her face went through 3 changes in the space of a second. Shock, then anger, then something worse than both. She knew this girl. Eliza, Ruth said. The name came out like a stone dropped into still water. The young woman, Eliza Mercer, dismounted before the horse fully stopped and nearly fell. She caught herself on the fence and looked at Ruth with red, swollen eyes and a face full of something that might have been guilt, or might have been fear, or might have been both tangled together so tight that even she could not tell them apart. Ruth, she said. Ruth, please, they are coming. A horse blowing hard after a long run. Then a woman's voice, young and breaking. Ruth had not seen Eliza in 8 months. The last time, Eliza had stood in their father's parlor and watched 2 men drag Ruth through the front door. She had not said a word. She had not moved. She had not lifted a single finger or raised a single objection while her older sister was hauled out of her own home like livestock bound for market. Ruth had spent 7 months hating her for that silence. Every night, in every camp, lying on dirt floors and wagon beds, she had built and rebuilt the memory of Eliza's face, the blankness of it, the way her half-sister's eyes had tracked Ruth's removal with the passive attention of someone watching weather move across a distant field. It had been the final wound, worse than the rope, worse than Briggs, because family was supposed to be the last wall that held, and Eliza had not even tried. Now Eliza was standing in a stranger's yard begging for help, and Ruth wanted to slam the gate in her face. She did not. She stood on the porch with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and waited for Eliza to stop crying long enough to explain why she was here. It took a while. Eliza was not a woman accustomed to delivering bad news under pressure. She had spent her entire life in rooms where other people handled the difficult conversations, and she simply existed, ornamental and quiet, exactly the way their father preferred his daughters. Holt Dawson dismounted and led his horse to water without saying much. He had the good sense to recognize that whatever was happening between these two women was not his conversation to enter. He leaned against the corral fence and waited. Silas stood beside Ruth, not touching her, not speaking, just present. Eliza wiped her face and took a breath that shook on the way in and shook worse on the way out. "He knows where you are," Eliza said. "Father knows." Ruth felt the words land but did not let them move her. She had been expecting them. Every day she had spent on this ranch, she had been waiting for exactly this sentence. "Virgil Creed," Eliza continued. "He sent a wire the night of the auction, not to Father, to a man named Wade Pewitt." The name meant nothing to Silas, but it meant everything to Ruth. She felt her stomach tighten like a fist closing. "Pewitt is already here," Eliza said. "He has been here since before the auction. He watched the whole thing. He watched them drag you out. He watched Silas buy the horses. He watched you walk away. He did nothing because he did not need to. He knew exactly where you were going." Ruth's mind was moving fast. The man at the auction, clean boots, notebook. She had not seen him because she had been too busy counting exits and scanning the crowd for threats she could identify. She had missed the one that was standing still. "How long?" Ruth said. "Weeks, maybe longer. Father sent him out ahead to wait. He knew you would surface eventually. Somewhere. Somehow. He just had to be patient." The clean-booted man, watching, writing, smiling when she walked away with Silas. He had not needed to intervene because she was doing exactly what he expected. Running to the first available shelter. Predictable. A rat finding a hole and the cat simply noting which hole. "Why are you telling me this?" Ruth said. Her voice was flat, controlled. The voice she used when the part of her that felt things needed to be locked in a room and the part that calculated needed to work. Eliza hesitated. Her hands moved to her stomach, a small gesture, almost unconscious. Ruth saw it. "Because after you left," Eliza said, "Father started treating me the way he treated you. Not hitting. He never hit. He does not need to. He just—" She paused, searching for words. "He made me part of it. Meetings, documents, contracts I did not understand but was told to sign as witness. He said it was family business and that family participates. And when I told him I did not want to, he looked at me and said, 'Remember what happened to your sister.'" The words sat in the air between them. Ruth felt them like a hand on her throat. "So you came because you are scared for yourself," Ruth said. "Not for me." "Yes," Eliza said. Her chin came up. "Not much, but enough." "Is that not enough?" Ruth almost said no. Almost said that self-interest was not the same as loyalty and that showing up now, 8 months late, with nothing but fear as a motive, did not erase standing silent in a parlor while two men destroyed her life. But then she caught herself. She caught the thought mid-stride and recognized it for what it was. She was evaluating Eliza's usefulness, calculating what this girl could offer, measuring her the way you measure a tool, by function, not by humanity. And that calculation, that cold automatic assessment, was exactly what her father did. To everyone. Always. The recognition hit her like cold water. She was Harlan Mercer's daughter in more ways than the blood. "You are safe here," Ruth said. The words surprised her. They surprised Eliza, too, who blinked and then started crying again, silently this time, with the particular desperation of someone who has been holding herself together for a very long time and just felt the first board give. There was more. Eliza was pregnant. She told Ruth this in the bunkhouse, alone, with the door shut and her voice barely above a whisper. The father was a boy named James Hadley, son of a rancher their father had foreclosed on 3 years earlier. Eliza had met him in town. They had been meeting in secret for months. If Harlan Mercer found out that his daughter was carrying the child of a man whose family he had destroyed, he would send Eliza away the same way he had sent Ruth. Or worse. Ruth sat across from her sister and absorbed this. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. Mercer's empire was being pulled apart from the inside by his own blood, his daughter's, one carrying evidence in her memory, the other carrying evidence in her body. both loving the people he had ruined. Eliza had brought one physical thing, a sealed envelope, heavy cream paper, wax stamp. Inside was a notarized copy of a payment agreement between their father and Judge Horace Whitley. $200 per month. The signature was Whitley's. The purpose was spelled out in language so careful it was almost artful. Consulting services for territorial land management review. But the dates on the payments matched perfectly with the dates of every dismissed lawsuit against Mercer Land and Rail. The judge was bought, and here was the receipt. "There is something else," Eliza said. "Father is coming. To Montana. Himself. First time in 20 years he has left the East." She looked at Ruth with an expression that was equal parts terror and something harder, something that looked almost like satisfaction. "He is not sending men anymore," Eliza said. "He is coming himself. That means he is scared." Ruth and Silas disagreed about what to do next. The disagreement was not the polite kind. It was the kind where two people who are both frightened and both stubborn say things that cut. "Helena," Ruth said. "We ride for Helena, the Territorial Records Office. If we can get the original surveys on the record before Father can suppress them, we have a chance." "Helena is 4 days through open country," Silas said. "The telegraph office is 11 miles. We ride to town, send a wire to the federal court in Helena, and let the law do the traveling." "The telegraph office is in town," Ruth said. "Creed's town. The man who sent the wire to Puit. We ride in there, and we are walking into a trap. We ride for Helena, and we are 4 days in the open with no supplies and Puit behind us." They were both right. They were both wrong. And neither one was willing to give ground, because giving ground meant trusting the other person's judgment more than their own, and trust was in short supply between a woman who had been sold by everyone she ever depended on, and a man who had failed every person he ever cared about. "You want the safe choice because you are used to losing," Ruth said. The words came out cold and precise, and she knew, even as she said them, that they were cruel. Silas's face tightened. "And you want the dramatic choice because you think suffering makes you right." The silence that followed was ugly. The kind of silence where both people realize they have said something true and something terrible at the same time, and neither one knows how to take it back. Eliza watched them from the corner of the room with the expression of someone who had grown up in a household where words were weapons, and who recognized the damage when she saw it. "There is a third option," Eliza said quietly, "but you will not like it." They both turned to look at her. "Father is coming here," Eliza said, "to Montana. Personally. He will arrive in days, not weeks. You cannot outrun him because he has money and horses and men at every station between here and Helena. You cannot telegraph ahead because Creed controls the wire. So you do the one thing he does not expect." She paused. "You split up. One person rides fast for Helena. The other two stay here and make enough noise to keep Puit watching the ranch. Bait and runner." Ruth understood immediately. She looked at Silas. He looked at her. The anger from a moment ago was still there, simmering, but under it was the beginning of something more useful. Calculation. Strategy. The awareness that fighting each other was a luxury they could not afford. Before anyone could decide anything, Holt's voice came from outside. "Rider coming, single horse, no hurry." Ruth went to the window. The afternoon light was gold and low, and it caught the rider in silhouette as he crested the small rise to the south. A man in a long dark coat, moving at an easy walk, no urgency. A badge on his chest catching the sun. Wade Puit, and he was carrying a white flag. The slow, rhythmic creak of saddle leather. Then a voice, calm and pleasant and reasonable, saying, "Afternoon, Mr. Kane." Silas had met exactly one rattlesnake in his life that did not rattle before it struck. It had been sunning itself on a warm rock, perfectly still, perfectly patient, and it had looked almost friendly right up until the moment it was not. Wade Puit reminded him of that snake, except the snake had not been carrying a badge. Puit dismounted at the gate with the easy grace of a man who had spent more time on horseback than most people spent on their feet. He was tall, clean-shaven, eyes the color of river stone, gray and smooth and giving away nothing. His clothes were trail-worn but well-made. His gun belt was oiled and his holster rode low on his hip and looked like it had been used more than once in ways that did not involve shooting at tin cans. He tied his horse to the fence post, tucked the white flag into his saddlebag, and stood at the gate with his hands visible and empty, a performance of harmlessness. Silas did not buy it for a second. "I know who you are," Silas said. He stood on the porch with his rifle leaning against the rail within arm's reach. Ruth was inside with Eliza. He could feel her watching through the window the way you can feel weather changing behind a mountain. "Then you know I am not here to make trouble," Pwitt said. He smiled. It was a good smile, the kind that made you want to trust him and then made you angry at yourself for wanting to. "My name is Wade Pwitt. I am a United States Marshal assigned to this territory, and I have come with a proposition. I did not invite you onto my property, Marshal." "No, sir, you did not. But what I have to say will take about 5 minutes and might save you a lifetime of grief." "May I?" Silas did not say yes. He did not say no. He just stood there, and Pwitt took the silence as permission, which was probably what he had planned from the start. Pwitt walked to the porch steps and stopped. He did not come up. He stood below, looking up at Silas, which was a neat trick because it made him seem deferential even though every line of his body said that he was the most dangerous person in any room he entered. "Mr. Kane, you have a woman on your property who is wanted for theft of private documents and destruction of property. Her name is Ruth Mercer. Her father is Harlan Mercer. I know who her father is. Then you know he is a man of considerable influence and resources. And you know that sheltering his daughter puts you in a position that is, and I say this respectfully, well above your weight class." Silas said nothing. Pwitt continued. "Mr. Mercer is not an unreasonable man. He understands that you came into this situation without full knowledge of what you were getting into. You bought 2 horses at auction and a problem got attached. That is not your fault. He is willing to acknowledge that." He paused. "Let the words settle. Here is what he is offering. Full return of your family's south pasture, the original 40 acres that were transferred to Mercer Land and Rail 8 years ago. Forgiveness of all outstanding debts held by the Territorial Bank, which Mr. Mercer has significant influence over. And a clean start. No charges, no complications. Your ranch whole again. Your debts erased. Everything your mother worked for returned." Silas felt something move in his chest. Not anger. Worse, hope. The south pasture. 40 acres of good grass and water that his mother had killed herself trying to hold on to and lost anyway. The land she talked about in her sleep at the end when she was too tired to know she was talking. The land that had broken her because losing it meant losing the last thing that made the struggle worth enduring. "And the price," Silas said. "Ruth goes home to her father. That is all. She goes home. You ride on with your ranch and your horses and your life, and this whole unpleasant business goes away like a bad dream." Silas looked out across his land. The crooked corral, the leaning barn, the house where his mother had died. He could have all of it back. Whole, free, the way it should have been if his father had not been a weak man and Mercer had not been a monster. Ruth was watching from the window. He could feel her eyes on him. He thought about what she had said, what his mother's journal had said, what the letters spelled out in cramped, painful handwriting. He thought about the south pasture and the green grass and the creek that ran through it clear and cold even in August. Pwitt waited, patient as stone. Silas extended his hand. Pwitt shook it. His grip was dry and firm. "Deal," Silas said. The word came out and hung in the air, and Silas knew even as he said it that something was wrong. Not with the deal, with him. Something in his gut had clenched shut like a trap and would not open. He looked up and saw Ruth's face in the window. Not angry, not betrayed. Blank. The emptied-out expression of a woman who had spent her entire life being traded and sold and handed off, and who had just watched it happen one more time. The same face she had worn at the auction when the auctioneer told Creed he could have her for $2. The face of a woman who had learned long ago that she would always be worth less than the dirt she was standing on. Silas pulled his hand back. Pueit held on for a half-second, just long enough for Silas to feel the strength in those fingers, and then released. A deal is a deal, Kane. Then I am a man who breaks deals. Puit's smile did not waver, not even a little. It stayed fixed and pleasant and patient, and that was more frightening than any threat could have been. Your father said the same thing, Pueit said. Elias Kane, good man, liked his cards and his whiskey, took a loan from Mr. Mercer to cover what the cards took from him, signed the papers neat as you please, then got religion and tried to report the man who had paid his debts. Look how that worked out for your family. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. He already knew what Pueit was saying because his mother's journal had laid it bare. But hearing it from Pueit, spoken out loud in that calm, conversational tone, was different. It was confirmation from the enemy, and it changed the shape of the wound. Your father was not a victim, Kane. He was a business partner who got cold feet, and your mother, God rest her, she was the one who paid for it. Not because Mercer is cruel, because your father broke his word. There are consequences for that. The world rearranged itself around Silas for the second time in 2 days. First his mother's journal, now Pueit. His father was not the broken-hearted rancher he had mourned for 8 years. He was a man who had gambled and lost, and borrowed from the wrong people, and then tried to play hero when it was too late. The cattle died because Elias Kane got brave after he got bought, and Margaret paid the price because she was the one who was strong enough to survive the wreckage her husband had created. Silas was the son of that man, standing on that man's porch, fighting that man's battle, and he was holding a bottle just like his father had held a bottle, and he had run away, just like his father had run away, and he had just shaken hands with the devil the way his father had shaken hands with the devil. The deal is off, Silas said. Pueit tipped his hat. I will come back tomorrow. Offers like this have expiration dates. He mounted his horse and rode away at an easy pace. A man with all the time in the world. Silas stood on the porch until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then the door opened behind him. You shook his hand, Ruth said. He turned. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her face unreadable. Not because she was hiding her emotions, but because the emotion she was feeling had no name. It lived somewhere between fury and resignation and the terrible, unsurprised exhaustion of a woman who had expected exactly this. I pulled back, Silas said. After. You pulled back after. For 5 seconds you sold me. He opened his mouth and closed it. There was no defense. She was right. For 5 seconds, with the south pasture dangling in front of him like water in a desert, he had chosen land over a living woman. He had done the math, and the math had told him that 40 acres of good grass was worth more than the person standing in front of him. That math was his father's math, and hearing it echo in his own head made him sick. Ruth, he said. She held up a hand. Not now. I cannot talk about this right now. She turned and went back inside. The door closed. Not a slam. Something quieter and worse. The sound of a door closing between two people who both know that something is broken, and neither one knows if it can be fixed. That night, Silas could not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water, because the whiskey was gone, and he had poured the last of it down the sink, and there was nothing left to hide behind. He stared at the wall and tried to calculate what he had lost in the space of 5 seconds. At some point after midnight, he heard the bunkhouse door open. Footsteps on dirt. The barn door. The sound of a horse being saddled. He was on his feet and outside in 30 seconds. The bunkhouse was empty. The bay gelding was gone. Ruth was gone. On the kitchen table, propped against the salt cellar, she had left the envelope Eliza had brought. The proof about Judge Whitley. Beside it was a scrap of paper torn from the edge of a feed receipt, her handwriting small and precise. This is worth more than I am. Use it. And the tin box where he had placed his mother's journal was open, empty. Ruth had taken it. Margaret Kane's journal, the only thing he had left of his mother. Eliza stood in the bunkhouse doorway staring at the dark road. "She is going to get herself killed," Eliza said. Silas was already pulling on his boots. "I know. Hoofbeats on hard-packed earth. Alone. At night." Then the sound of breathing, measured and deliberate. The breathing of a woman who had learned to control her fear by controlling her lungs. Ruth had been running for 7 months. She was good at it. The way a person gets good at bleeding, not by choice but by practice. The gelding moved steady beneath her, its hooves finding the path through the dark by instinct more than sight. The moon was a thin crescent, barely enough to see by, and Ruth navigated by memory, and by the bitterroot peaks that cut black shapes against the stars to the west. She had not planned to leave. Not exactly. The plan had been to stay, to use Silas and his ranch as a base, to build a case and find an ally with legal authority, and bring her father down piece by careful piece. Then Silas shook Puit's hand. 5 seconds. That was all it took. 5 seconds of watching another man calculate her value and find it less than land. She had seen that calculation before, in every camp, in every wagon, in the eyes of every man who had handled her for 7 months. She was a thing to be measured against something more useful, and she always lost. She should have been used to it by now. She was not. That was the part she could not forgive. Not Silas for making the calculation, but herself for still being surprised by it, for still expecting something different, for still, after everything, believing that someone might look at her and see a person instead of a price. She stopped at a creek to water the horse. The gelding drank long and grateful. Ruth knelt beside it and cupped water in her hands and drank and sat back on her heels and let the darkness settle around her. Her hands were shaking, not from cold. This was the first time in 7 months she was entirely alone by choice. Every other time, isolation had been forced on her, a punishment, a condition of transport. She had been alone in camps where the men slept, and she lay awake counting sounds. She had been alone in root cellars and wagon beds, and once for 3 days, in a lined cabin on a ridge where the snow piled up past the window, and she was not sure anyone was coming back. But this was different. This time she had chosen it. She had walked out of a place where she was welcome, however imperfectly, and into the dark because she could not bear to stay. Why? The question pressed at her, and she tried to answer it honestly, because she was 23 years old and had survived things that should have killed her, and she owed herself at least the truth. She left because she could not endure the moment when someone decided she was not worth keeping. That was the answer. Simple and terrible. She ran before she could be abandoned. She had been doing it her entire life. Before the camps, before the auction, before any of it. She had run from friends at school who might have tired of her. She had run from a boy in her father's kitchen who had smiled at her once and might not have smiled again. She had run from her own mother's grave because standing there meant feeling what it was like to lose someone. And she had decided at 12 years old that she would rather lose herself first. This was the pattern. Clear as a trail in fresh snow. She ran. Always. Before anyone could make the choice for her. She sat by the creek and thought about a night 4 months ago. A specific night. A camp by a river where the water ran black under no moon. She had been passed from Briggs to another outfit, a group of men hauling timber south. And they had left her untied because there was nowhere to go, and she was too thin to be worth chasing. She had walked to the river and stood at the edge and looked at the water and thought about stepping in. Not dramatically, not with despair or ceremony, just stepping forward until the current took over and made the decision for her. She had stood there for a long time, long enough that her feet went numb in the cold mud. She did not step in. Not because she was brave or because she wanted revenge, or because she had some grand purpose burning inside her that demanded she survive. She stayed on the bank because it started raining the next morning and she wanted to see the rain. That was all. A small, absurd reason. The kind of reason that does not fit into stories about courage and survival. She wanted to feel rain on her face, and so she stayed alive. She thought about that now, kneeling by a different creek in a different night, and she understood something she had not understood before. She was still alive not because she was strong. She was still alive because she kept finding small reasons not to stop. Rain, a hinge that needed oiling, a fence rail that was loose. Things that mattered for no reason except that she decided they mattered. And that decision, over and over again, was the only thing between her and the river. She also carried something she had not told Silas about. Margaret Kane's journal. She had taken it from the tin box while Silas was on the porch with Pete. She had taken it not to protect it and not to preserve it, but because the journal contained Margaret's notes about Elias Kane's loan from Mercer. And Ruth had wanted leverage, insurance, a backup plan in case Silas changed his mind. Because that was what she did. She collected advantages. She stockpiled power over the people around her the way other people stockpiled food or ammunition. It was the manipulator's reflex, bred into her by 7 months of having nothing but her ability to make herself necessary. And she had turned that reflex on the one person who had said untie her. She hated herself for it. She hated that the first thing she thought when she opened that tin box was not "this is a dead woman's final words," but "this is something I can use." She hated that she was her father's daughter in the way that mattered most, the part that calculated, the part that used people, the part that saw everything and everyone as a means to some end. The horse lifted its head from the water and stood listening. Ruth listened too. Hoofbeats. 2 horses, coming from the south, coming fast. She grabbed a stone from the creek bed, sharp enough to cut, and pressed her back against the rock face and waited. Silas came around the bend first, Eliza behind him. Ruth's hand tightened on the stone before she recognized his silhouette. When she did recognize it, she did not feel relief. She felt anger. "I left so you could take the deal," she said. Silas dismounted. His face was hard to read in the dark, but his voice was not. "There is no deal. There was never going to be a deal. I just needed 5 minutes to stop wanting to dig up my father's grave and spit in it." Ruth did not lower the stone. "That is not why I left. I know why you left. You left because I shook his hand, and you were right to go." Silence. The creek running. The horses breathing. Eliza staying quiet on her mare, watching with the careful attention of a woman who grew up in a house where every conversation was a negotiation and every silence was a threat. Then Silas said it. "You took my mother's journal." Ruth felt the words land like a slap. Not because she did not expect them, but because hearing them spoken out loud made the things she had done solid and real and impossible to explain away. "Not to protect it," Silas said. "To use it, because it has the parts about my father's loan, and you wanted something to hold over me." "Yes," Ruth said. The word came out flat. No excuse, no justification. "Yes, that is exactly why I took it." He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "My mother wrote that journal while she was dying alone in a bunkhouse because her husband betrayed her. And you took it to use as a bargaining chip. That makes you—" He stopped. Ruth finished it. "That makes me my father's daughter." The words hung in the cold mountain air. A coyote called somewhere in the distance and was not answered. Then Ruth opened the saddlebag, pulled out the journal, and held it out toward him. No apology, no explanation, just the journal, offered back. Silas took it. He held it in both hands the way he always held it, careful, like something that could still break. And they stood there in the dark, 2 damaged people beside a creek. And the thing that passed between them was not forgiveness. It was recognition. They were both capable of terrible choices. They both knew it now. And somehow knowing the worst about each other was more honest than anything they had shared before. "We ride together," Silas said. "Or not at all." Ruth nodded, once. They mounted up. Eliza fell in beside them, and the 3 of them rode west into the last hours of darkness. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say that the silence did not say better. Silas and Ruth rode side by side, and the distance between their horses was maybe 3 feet. Not close enough to touch. Not far enough to pretend they were strangers. The exact distance of two people who had hurt each other and were choosing for now to keep going in the same direction. An hour before dawn, Eliza pulled up short. She was studying the ground. "Trail markers," she said. "Broken branches. Stones stacked in patterns." She looked up at Silas and Ruth with an expression that was not fear exactly, but something older and colder. "These are Puits. His men are not behind us. They are ahead. They knew where we were going before we did." The sky in the east was starting to lighten. Gray first, then a thin line of gold along the ridge. They pushed the horses up the final grade and crested the pass and looked down into the valley below. Helena sat in the distance. 6 miles, maybe. They could see the church steeple and the rooftops and the thin threads of chimney smoke rising in the morning air. Between them and the town, on the main road where it curved south toward the valley floor, was a wagon train, 6 wagons, fine horses, and flying from the lead wagon, a flag that Ruth recognized from 1,000 documents and 1,000 nightmares. Mercer Land and Rail. Harlan Mercer had arrived. Wind through headstones, the scrape of fingertips on carved stone. The last time Ruth saw her father, he had been standing in his study backlit by the fire, and he had said, "You are no longer my daughter," with the same tone he used to dismiss servants. She had spent 7 months replaying that voice in every camp and every cage. Now she was about to hear it in person, and she was terrified. Not of what he would say, of the part of her that still wanted him to take it back. The main road into Helena was blocked. Mercer's wagons sat at the southern approach like a barricade, and even from the hillside Ruth could see riders stationed at intervals along the route. Not soldiers, private men, the kind who carried guns because they were paid to, not because they had sworn an oath. "We cannot take the road," Silas said. Eliza shook her head. "And the old logging road is out. Father bought the logging company 10 years ago. He knows every mile of it." Ruth studied the terrain. Below them to the west, set on a hillside that overlooked the town, was the Helena Cemetery. It had no road access, just a narrow footpath that wound down through the headstones and connected to the residential streets on the west side of town. Nobody guarded a cemetery. "We walk the horses through," Ruth said. She pointed. "Down through the graves. The path comes out behind the boarding houses on 6th Street. From there it is 3 blocks to Main." They dismounted and led the horses by hand. The cemetery was quiet in a way that felt intentional, as if the dead had agreed to hold still and watch. Ruth moved between the headstones, reading names she did not know, and dates that told small stories. Born 1841, died 1876. Beloved wife and mother, born 1869. Died 1870. A child's grave with a marble lamb on top. Then she stopped. Thomas Sutter. Born 1838. Died 1874. Rest in peace. Tom Sutter. The rancher who had fought Mercer's survey fraud and lost. Killed during a prisoner transport overseen by Wade Pewitt. Called an escape attempt. No investigation, no questions. Ruth touched the headstone. Her fingers traced the letters of his name. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say to a dead man who had been murdered for standing up, but she pressed her palm flat against the cold stone and held it there, and let herself feel the weight of what her father had done. Not as an abstraction, not as a line in a journal, as a name carved in marble over a body in the ground. Silas watched her from a few paces away. He did not interrupt. He understood something he could not have understood before he shook Puit's hand, and watched himself become the kind of man who trades a person for a pasture. He understood that Ruth carried the weight of her father's victims the way he carried his mother's death. Not guilt, exactly. Something heavier. Inheritance. They came down off the hillside and into Helena from the west. The streets were busy enough to give them cover. Ruth tucked her hair under a borrowed hat of Eliza's and kept her head low. Silas led the horses. Eliza walked between them, one hand resting on her stomach in that unconscious gesture that Ruth was beginning to recognize as the tell of a woman protecting something she had not yet told the world about. Judge Samuel Craddock's office was on the second floor of the courthouse, a two-story building with a brass plate beside the door. Ruth had memorized its location from the old freight maps that Ida Polk had given her along with the logging road directions. They tied the horses in an alley, and Ruth climbed the stairs alone. She did not want Silas beside her for this. Not because she did not trust him, because this was her fight and she needed to stand in it by herself before she could stand in it with anyone else. The door was open. A clerk sat at a desk in the anteroom. Behind him, through a half-open door, Ruth could see a man at a large desk covered in papers. White-haired, spectacles, vest and shirt sleeves, Judge Craddock. She stepped past the clerk before he could stop her and walked into the office. "My name is Ruth Mercer," she said. "Harlan Mercer is my father. I have evidence that will dismantle every fraudulent land claim in this territory." Craddock looked up. His eyes moved over her. The torn dress, the dirty bare feet, the hat pulled low. He studied her face the way a judge studies evidence, with patience and precision, and the awareness that first impressions are almost always incomplete. "Miss Mercer," he said. His voice was careful. "I know who you are. Then you know why I am here. I know why you believe you are here. But I received a filing 2 days ago. A petition for incompetency review in your name submitted by your father's attorneys through Judge Whitley's court. Under territorial procedure, I cannot take testimony or receive evidence from a subject under active mental competency review. If I do, opposing counsel will argue the entire proceeding is contaminated from the start." Ruth felt the floor drop. "That petition is a weapon," she said. "Whitley is bought and paid for. I have proof. A notarized payment agreement between my father and Whitley showing $200 a month for consulting services. The dates line up with every dismissed lawsuit against Mercer Land and Rail." Craddock leaned back in his chair. He removed his spectacles and cleaned them on his vest. A deliberate gesture. The gesture of a man buying time to think. "Then get the petition dismissed," he said. "If you can show me that Whitley was compromised, I can hear an emergency motion to strike any filing from his court. But until that petition is dealt with, my hands are tied. I am sorry, Miss Mercer. I believe you. But believing you and being able to act on it are not the same thing." Ruth stood in that office and felt the full, crushing weight of her father's genius. He had not sent men to stop her. He had not blocked the roads, though he had done that too. He had used the law itself as a shield, filed a piece of paper that turned Ruth from a witness into a suspect, made her testimony inadmissible before she could even open her mouth. The same weapon he always used. The system, the rules, the machinery of order that was supposed to protect people like her turned against her with surgical precision. She went back downstairs and told Silas and Eliza. Eliza's face went tight, but she did not crumble. She had grown up watching her father use courts the way other men used cattle prods, and she understood the machinery. "There is one other person in this town with access to territorial records," Eliza said. "The territorial clerk, Benjamin Fossey." "Fossey works for the governor," Ruth said, "and the governor works for Father." "Fossey used to work for Father," Eliza corrected. "Then Father stopped paying him. People develop remarkable principles when the money dries up. They found Fossey in his office at the Records Building. A small man with a small mustache and the watchful, flinching demeanor of a man who had spent too many years standing too close to powerful people and getting burned by the heat. He did not want to help. He wanted to survive. He said as much plainly without apology, because men like Fossey had learned that honesty about their cowardice was the only form of integrity left to them. Ruth did not beg. She did not appeal to his conscience because she suspected he had pawned it years ago. She appealed to his fear. "My father will be indicted," she said. The only question is whether you are standing on his side of the courtroom or mine when it happens. Choose now." Fosse stared at her, swallowed, looked at the door as if calculating how quickly he could reach it. Then he opened his desk drawer, pulled out a ring of keys, and said, 2 hours. After that, I was never here, and this conversation never happened. The Territorial Records Vault was in the basement of the building. Stone walls, gas lamps, rows of shelves holding 20 years of land filings, survey records, tax assessments, and correspondence. The accumulated paper of a territory that was being built and stolen, one document at a time. Ruth worked fast. She found the original survey records, the ones filed before Mercer's men began altering them, and laid them beside the versions currently on record. The differences were obvious. Boundary lines shifted, markers moved, parcels redrawn to absorb neighboring claims, dozens of them, a pattern of systematic theft so brazen it was almost elegant. Eliza searched a different section and found something that stopped them all. The original loan agreement between Mercer and Elias Kane. The signature, the date, the amount, $300. There it was in black ink on yellowing paper, proof that Silas's father had taken money from the man who destroyed him. Silas stared at the document. His face did not change. He had already read his mother's account. He already knew the truth. But seeing it in his father's own hand, the signature small and cramped and slanting to the right the way signatures do when the writer's hand is not steady, that was different. Paper made it permanent. Paper made it real. Ruth watched him. She knew what she was supposed to say. She was supposed to say they could leave it out, pretend it did not exist, build their case on the parts of the truth that served them, and bury the parts that did not. "We can leave that one out," she said quietly. Silas looked at her. His eyes were steady and older than they had been 2 days ago. "No. Everything goes in. Every page." He picked up the document and set it on the pile with the rest. His father's shame alongside his mother's courage. The complete truth. All of it. Ruth felt something shift in her chest. Not affection. Not yet. Something more fundamental. Respect. The deep, hard-earned kind that comes when you watch someone choose honesty over comfort and know exactly what it costs them. Meanwhile, Eliza had been searching the filing records for the incompetency petition. She found it, reviewed it, and found the key. The petition was filed through Whitley's court, she told Ruth, but Whitley does not have jurisdiction over federal proceedings. Craddock does. If we can show Craddock that Whitley was corrupt when he accepted the filing, Craddock can dismiss it himself as an emergency action, and we now have the payment records to prove exactly that. Ruth looked at her little sister with something approaching wonder. Eliza had spent her childhood watching their father build traps. Now she was dismantling one. Fosse checked his watch. 1 hour left, he said. Then footsteps in the corridor. Heavy, even, purposeful. The sound of expensive boots on stone floors. Fosse went white. "He is here." The vault door opened. Harlan Mercer stood in the doorway. He was not the monster Ruth had built in her memory over 7 months. He was a man, older than she remembered, hair gone from iron gray to white, shoulders still straight but thinner somehow, as if the frame that held him up had begun to shrink. His eyes were the same, dark, steady, intelligent, the eyes of a man who had never lost a negotiation in his life because he understood something about people that most people refuse to admit about themselves. Everyone has a price. You just have to find it. He looked at Ruth, then at Eliza. Something passed across his face when he saw them standing together. Not anger, surprise maybe, or grief, or the thing that lives at the intersection of both. "Come home, Ruth," he said, "both of you. This has gone far enough." His voice was gentle. The voice a father uses with a child who has run away and gotten lost and needs to be brought back to warmth and safety. Ruth knew that voice. She had loved that voice once. He had used it to read her stories at bedtime. A book about a girl who found her way home through the woods. He had used it to comfort her when her mother died. He had used it to tell her that everything would be all right. And the worst part, the part that made her hands shake and her breath catch and every wall she had built in 7 months tremble at its foundations, was that he sounded like he meant it. A chair scraping on stone floor, then breathing. 2 people, father and daughter, close enough to touch. Silas had expected Harlan Mercer to look like a villain. He did not. He looked like somebody's grandfather, tired, dignified, a little sad around the edges. And that, Silas realized, was exactly what made the man so dangerous. Mercer did not shout. He did not threaten. He did not bring armed men into the vault or attempt to seize the documents spread across the table. He pulled out a chair and sat down and folded his hands and talked. He talked about Ruth's mother, his first wife, Catherine, about the fever that took her, about standing in the doorway of their bedroom watching the doctor shake his head and knowing that the most important person in his world was leaving and there was nothing his money or his power or his will could do to stop it. "I lost my compass when she died," Mercer said. "I know that sounds like an excuse. Maybe it is. But you were so young, Ruth. You were 12 years old and you looked at me with your mother's eyes, and every time I saw you, I saw her, and I could not bear it. So I buried myself in the work, in the company, in the building. I told myself I was doing it for you, for Eliza, for the family, but I was doing it because the work did not look at me with Catherine's face and ask me why I let her die." Silas watched Ruth. She stood across the table from her father with her hands at her sides and her face fighting a war between the woman she had become and the girl she had been. He could see it, the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers opened and closed, the way her eyes kept returning to Mercer's face with something that looked dangerously like hope. Mercer kept talking about the mistakes, the deals that went wrong, the pressure that built and built until the only way forward was more of the same. "I am not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I am asking you to come home. Let me make it right. Whatever you need. Whatever it takes." Ruth stepped forward. 1 step, 2, 3. Not tactical, not calculated. This was the child inside her moving before the woman could stop it. 10 years old again, standing in a doorway after her mother's funeral, wanting her father to hold her. Her hand began to rise, reaching. Silas saw Mercer's face change. A flicker. Tiny. The micro-expression of a man watching a strategy work. Not warmth, triumph, just for an instant. Then it was gone, replaced by the grief and gentleness again. But Silas had seen it, and it chilled him the way a snake chills you even after it has moved on, because you know it was there. Ruth stopped at the 4th step. She stopped herself. Her hand dropped to her side and her fingers curled inward, and the reaching girl disappeared behind the measured woman. Those 3 steps were the most honest thing in the entire story. The moment that cracked open the armored, calculating survivor and showed the bruised child underneath. 3 steps toward a man who had sold her into slavery because he could not look at her face without seeing her mother's. "You sent me to a cattle camp, Father," Ruth said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "You sold me to men who traded me for labor and supplies, for 7 months, and now you want me to come home." "I made a mistake," Mercer said. "Parents make mistakes. Parents do not sell their children." The room was very still. Fossey stood pressed against the far wall like a man trying to disappear into the stone. Eliza stood behind Ruth. Silas stood by the door. And then the door opened again, and Wade Pwitt walked in. He did not stand beside Mercer. He stood apart, against the opposite wall. Separate. His badge was pinned to his coat, and his face was the same pleasant mask it always wore, but something in his posture had changed. He was angled away from Mercer, facing the room, not with it. Mercer looked at him with surprise that hardened quickly into understanding. Pwitt produced a document from inside his coat, folded, official. He set it on the table. "Federal investigation order," Pwitt said, "issued by the United States Marshal's Office in Denver, naming Harlan Mercer as the subject of inquiry into territorial land fraud, bribery of public officials, and conspiracy to commit murder. Mercer stared at him. "I have been keeping records," Pweet said. His voice was the same calm, pleasant tone it always was. "Every transaction, every order, every name and date and dollar, 5 years' worth, filed in triplicate with the Denver office, my personal attorney in St. Louis, and a safe deposit box in Chicago." "You," Mercer said. The word came out flat and cold. "Self-preservation, Harlan, you taught me that." The mask fell. The grandfather disappeared. The sad, gentle father vanished. What was underneath was clean and hard and ancient. Pure rage, controlled and compressed into a face that did not move except for the eyes, which burned with the particular fury of a man who understands he has been betrayed by the tool he trusted most. He turned to Ruth. "You think this is victory?" Pweet will say anything to save himself. Every judge in this territory knows what a bought witness looks like. And you, he paused, you are my daughter. Every courtroom in this country will ask what kind of woman destroys her own father. They will call you unstable. They will call you vindictive. They will say you were manipulated or mad or both. And part of you knows they would be right. Ruth did not fire back. She did not deliver a speech. She shook. Because he was right about one thing. Part of her wanted to destroy him, not for justice, for the throwing away, for the 7 months, for the rope and the auction, and every night she slept on dirt because her father had decided she was inconvenient. Her motives were not pure. They never had been. And standing in this room with the evidence on the table and her father across from her, she could not pretend otherwise. Silas stepped forward. He set Margaret Kane's journal on the table beside Pweet's documents. "This woman kept records for 10 years, Silas said. His voice was quiet. He was not making a speech either. He was stating a fact. "She never met your daughter. She had no reason to lie. She wrote down what happened to her family and to every family in this territory that your company destroyed. And what she wrote matches everything Ruth says. Date for date, dollar for dollar." He looked at Mercer. "This is not one witness. This is 2. From different decades, with no connection to each other. And they tell the same story. Independent corroboration. Not rhetoric. Proof." Mercer looked at the journal, at the documents, at Pweet's investigation order, at Ruth, at Silas. Then he looked at Eliza. He had not spoken to Eliza since entering the room, had barely glanced at her. But now his eyes found his younger daughter, and something in his face came apart. Because Eliza was standing beside Ruth. Both daughters, shoulder to shoulder, united not by love, not yet, but by a shared understanding that the man in front of them was not a father. He was a force that had shaped their lives through destruction, and that they could not outgrow him until they outfaced him. "Eliza," Mercer said. His voice cracked on the name. Eliza spoke for the first time. One sentence, quiet and steady and devastating. "Mother would have hated what you became." Mercer stood up. He did not slam the chair, he did not threaten, he did not issue commands. He picked up a small book from the table, a worn leather volume he had set down when he sat, and slipped it into his coat pocket. Then he turned and walked out of the room, not a villain making a dramatic exit. An old man leaving a room where he had just lost the last 2 people who might have loved him. The difference was important, because if he was only a villain, this would be simple. But he was also a father, and that was what made it hurt. After he left, things moved quickly. Fossey signed the certification of the survey records with hands that trembled. Pweet signed his sworn deposition. The documents were sealed and prepared for dispatch to the Territorial Marshal's office in Denver by federal courier. Eliza took the evidence of Judge Whitley's corruption to Judge Craddock. Within the hour, Craddock dismissed the incompetency petition and issued an emergency protection order in Ruth's name. The legal shield Mercer had built was turned against him. That night at the boarding house, Ruth sat on the bed and stared at the wall. "He's right about one thing," she said. "Part of me wanted to destroy him, not for justice. Because he threw me away." Silence. "Does that make everything I said less true?" Silas did not answer immediately. He sat across from her in a chair by the window with his hat on his knee and thought about the question the way it deserved to be thought about. Not quick, not easy. I shook Puit's hand, he said finally. For 5 seconds, I sold you for a pasture. Does that make me a bad man? I do not know, neither do I. But I know what I did after, and I know what you did after. Maybe that is the part that counts. It was not a resolution. It was not a declaration. It was two people sitting with an honest question and agreeing that they did not have the answer, and that this was better than pretending they did. Ruth looked at him across the dim room. He looked at her, and the thing between them was not love, not yet, but it was the soil that love grows in. Honesty, damage, the willingness to stay in the room when staying is harder than leaving. The staccato click of a telegraph key. Then silence. Then Holt Dawson's voice reading aloud with shaking hands. Barn gone, house burning. Come home or do not. Will not matter much either way. The telegram arrived at 3 in the morning. Silas read it twice and then folded it, and put it in his pocket and stood in the hallway of the boarding house and felt the last solid thing in his life crumble to powder. They rode out at dawn. Silas, Ruth, Eliza, and 2 ranchers from neighboring spreads who had heard Ruth's name in town and had come looking for her because they had their own stories about Mercer land and rail, and for the first time believed someone might actually listen. One was Holt Dawson, who had ridden to Helena carrying the telegram himself because he trusted no one else to deliver it. The other was a woman named Eleanor Bryce, 60 years old, iron-gray hair, rifle across her saddle. She had buried her husband Thomas 12 years ago after a Mercer foreclosure drove him to drink and a frozen creek. She had not spoken about it since. She did not speak about it now. She simply appeared at the boarding house door with her horse saddled and her jaw set and said, "I am coming." They reached the ranch by late afternoon. The barn was gone, blackened timbers jutting from the ground like broken fingers. The corral fence lay in splinters. And the house. The house where Margaret Kane had lived and worked and kept her ledgers and died. The house that Silas had grown up in, where he had learned to walk and eat and speak and hide from the sound of his father's boots on the floorboard. That house was a smoking ruin, walls collapsed inward, roof gone, the chimney standing alone like a headstone. Holt met them at what used to be the gate. His hands were bandaged in strips of cotton that were already staining through with fluid from the burns underneath. He had pulled the horses out of the barn before the roof came down. He had tried to get inside the house. The heat drove him back. 3 men, Holt said, came just after midnight. Torches. I fired 2 shots from my place and they scattered, but the damage was done by then. He looked at Silas with something that was not pity, harder than that. Solidarity. I am sorry, Kane. I got here as fast as I could. Silas dismounted and walked to the house. What was left of it? He stood at the edge of the ash and looked at the wreckage. The iron stove still standing in the rubble. The frame of the kitchen table. A tin cup, blackened, lying on its side. Ruth stood beside him. She did not say it would be all right. She did not say they would rebuild. She did not say a single word because she understood that some losses require silence the way wounds require air. The tin box. Silas's voice was flat. The one under the bed. My mother's letters. The one she wrote to me. Gone. They both knew it. The copies of the key documents were already on their way to Denver by federal courier. The evidence was preserved, but the original journal, Margaret's handwriting, the paper she had touched and pressed and cried over, the physical thing that still carried some trace of the woman who wrote it, that was ash now. Along with everything else. Silas reached into his coat. Ruth saw what he was reaching for. The bottle. He had been carrying it since the auction. She had smelled it on him every day. She had watched him pour whiskey and pour it out and pour it again, and she had said nothing because it was not her battle. He pulled out the bottle. It was half full. He had refilled it at some point during the ride. She did not know when. He poured a glass. The glass was a tin cup he had taken from the boarding house. He filled it and stood there looking at it. Ruth said nothing. She had no right. This was his grief and his vice and his choice. She could not save him from it any more than he could have saved her from the river that night 4 months ago. Some decisions belong to the person making them, and no one else. Silas looked at the whiskey, looked at the ashes, looked at the cup in his hand. He drank it. Then he threw the cup into the ruins. It hit a blackened beam and bounced and landed in the ash and lay there. Last one, he said. Not a speech, not a vow. A decision made quietly in front of a burned house with a woman standing beside him who did not try to stop him, and did not try to save him, and did not do anything except be present while he chose. It would not be the last temptation. They both knew that. But it was the first line drawn in the dirt, and lines drawn in dirt are how fences start. The neighbors came, not all of them. A rancher named Gus Hadley refused. Said it straight to Silas's face in front of everyone. "You brought this on yourself, Kane. Should have taken the deal and kept your head down." He rode away and nobody stopped him because he was not wrong exactly. He was just afraid. And fear was a human thing, and the story had room for it. But others came, Holt with his bandaged hands and a hammer he could barely hold. Eleanor Bryce with blankets and nails and the quiet authority of a woman who had survived worse than fire. 4 other families from ranches within riding distance carrying lumber and tools and food and the particular energy of people who have been suffering alone and have just discovered they were not alone after all. They started clearing rubble before sundown. Ruth worked beside Eliza, pulling charred wood from the wreckage and stacking it. The 2 sisters had not embraced, had not wept together, had not said "I forgive you" or "I love you" or any of the things that families say in stories where reconciliation comes easy. What they did was work, side by side, in silence. Until Eliza stopped. She was holding a piece of blackened wood, and tears were running down her face, and she said, "I stood there when they took you. I did not move." Ruth straightened, looked at her sister. "I know," Ruth said. "I was 16. I know that too. Does it matter?" Ruth thought about it, carefully, because easy answers were lies, and this moment deserved better. "It matters," she said. "But it is not the whole story of who you are." She put her hand on Eliza's arm, briefly, then picked up another piece of wood and went back to work. Late that afternoon, Judge Craddock arrived from Helena with 2 territorial marshals riding escort. He carried documents. The incompetency petition had been formally dismissed. Arrest warrants had been issued through the territorial marshal's office in Denver for Harlan Mercer, Virgil Creed, and 3 associates of Mercer Land and Rail. Wade Pruitt had signed his full deposition and been granted immunity as a cooperating witness. Craddock also brought a court order suspending all fee collections by Mercer Land and Rail pending the outcome of the investigation. Every spur fee, every access charge, every water rights diversion. Suspended, effective immediately. Silas did the math in his head. The fees he had been paying for 8 years, fees for access to land that was already public, fees that had drained his ranch and driven his mother to her grave. Those fees had just stopped. The money he would save in the next 6 months alone was enough to settle his bank debt and keep the ranch alive. The south pasture was not returned. Not yet. The legal process for reversing fraudulent land transfers would take months, maybe years. Craddock was honest about that. "Justice is not a door that opens," the judge said. "It is a road, and you will be walking it for a while yet." But the ranch would survive, barely, by its fingernails. But survive was what Kane's did. And for the first time in 8 years, Silas could see a path forward that did not require a bottle to walk. That evening, As the frame of a new house began to rise on the old foundations, Ruth stood on the bare ground where the porch had been and watched the neighbors work. Silas came to stand beside her. She took his hand. Not out of fear, not because she needed steadying, not as strategy or calculation or survival reflex. She took his hand because she wanted to, because her fingers wanted to hold something warm and living, and because his hand was there and she was tired of running from every impulse that was not born of self-preservation. "I have nowhere to go," she said, but her voice was not sad. It sounded like beginning. "You have here," he said. From the road came a sound, shuffling footsteps, slow and heavy. No hoofbeats, someone walking. Wade Puit came around the bend of the road. Alone. No horse, no badge. His coat was torn. His face was bloody. He was holding his left arm against his body, at an angle that said something was broken. He made it to the place where the gate used to be and stopped. Mercer's men had found the traitor before the warrants were served. Ruth looked at him. The man who had watched her be sold, who had tracked her across the territory, who had shaken her captor's hand and smiled, who had let her suffer for 7 months because documenting her suffering was more useful to him than stopping it. She looked at him and saw the thing she hated most in the world, her father's weapon, broken and discarded, just like she had been. "Bring him inside," she said. A man's labored breathing, boot soles dragging on dirt, then water being poured into a basin and cloth being torn for bandages. They laid Puit on the floor of the half-built bunkhouse because there was nowhere else. Eleanor Bryce set his arm with the matter-of-fact competence of a woman who had set bones before on cattle and on men, and who did not see much difference between the two when it came to the basic mechanics of healing. Puit did not thank them. He lay on his back, looking at the rafters with the new wood beams above him, where the roof would be, and said nothing for a long time. Then he spoke, to Ruth. "Your father sent me to find you 7 months ago. I had your location at the second camp. I could have brought you back in a week." Ruth stood in the doorway. "Why did you not?" "Because I was building a file. Every camp you passed through, every man who handled you, every transaction, every mile. I documented all of it. Not for you, for me. Insurance, in case your father decided I was expendable. Which," he glanced at his broken arm, "it turns out he did." He paused, swallowed. "I let you suffer for 7 months so I could build a case to protect myself. I am not telling you this because I want forgiveness. I am telling you because you deserve to know exactly what kind of man your father hired and exactly how little any of us cared about what happened to you." Ruth absorbed this. It was horrible. It was honest. And it was the final piece. Even Puit's supposed help, his turning witness, his documentation of Mercer's crimes, none of it had ever been about her. She was a means, a data point, a line in someone else's ledger until Silas, drunk, broken, unreliable Silas, who had said untie her without knowing why, and who had shaken the devil's hand and pulled back, and who had chosen to put every page of truth on the record, including the page that shamed his own father. Silas, who was not brave and not noble and not heroic, who was just a man who kept choosing to do the right thing slightly more often than he chose not to, and who understood that this was the most any person could honestly promise. "Thank you for telling me," Ruth said to Puit. "Nothing else." She walked out. Silas was waiting on the ground outside, sitting on a section of new lumber that would become a porch step in a few days. He did not ask what Puit had said. He could tell from her face that it had been bad and that she did not need to repeat it. "He stays until the marshals come for him," Silas said. "Then he is their problem." Ruth sat down beside him. "Yes." 3 days later, the territorial marshals arrived from Denver. 2 men on government horses with warrants and handcuffs, and the particular grim patience of lawmen who had ridden a long way to do an unpleasant job. They took Puit into custody as a material witness, which meant protective custody until the trial, which meant he would be held at the territorial facility in Deer Lodge under guard. They also brought news. Harlan Mercer had been arrested at the Helena rail station attempting to board a train east. He had gone quietly. No protest, no threats. He had handed over his personal effects and walked into the custody of the marshals with the dignity of a man who understood that the performance of composure was his last remaining weapon. He was being held at the territorial prison in Deer Lodge pending trial. Virgil Creed had been arrested at the saloon in town, drunk and loud and surprised that anyone had come for him at all. Judge Whitley had resigned his position before charges could be formally filed, which would not save him from prosecution, but would at least save the territory the embarrassment of removing him. Craddock sent a message with the marshals. The trials will take time, the land cases will take longer, but the machinery is in motion and it cannot be stopped now. Prepare yourselves for a long road. Ruth read the message and folded it and put it in her pocket. She had been preparing for a long road her entire life. A few more years did not frighten her. 3 weeks passed. The new house went up slowly, smaller than the original. 1 story instead of the story and a half that Margaret Kane had maintained. The wood was raw and pale and smelled of pine sap and fresh-cut lumber. The roof was tight. The windows were square. The door hung on hinges that Ruth had helped install, and that she had oiled herself carefully because she understood now that small things were not small. They were the foundation of everything. Holt Dawson came every other day with his bandaged hands and his hammer. He could not grip properly, but he could swing from the wrists, and he did for hours without complaint. His 80 acres were part of the investigation now. His land might come back to him, might not. Either way, he swung the hammer. Eleanor Bryce supervised the framing with the authority of a woman who had built a life alone after her husband died, and who knew exactly how much weight a beam could bear because she had tested her own limits every day for 12 years. She did not speak of her husband. She did not need to. Her presence was the speech. Eliza stayed. She had made the choice to remain in Montana rather than return east. The baby would be born in winter. She had written to James Hadley, the father, and he had written back within the week. He was coming. That was all the letter said, but it was enough. Ruth did not read the letter. She respected the privacy of it. But she saw Eliza's face when it arrived, and she recognized the expression because she had felt it herself recently, standing on bare ground with her hand in Silas's. Relief. The kind that is so deep it looks like pain. The south pasture was not returned. Not yet. The legal process ground forward at the speed of bureaucracy and justice, which was slow. But the court order suspending Mercer's fees had given Silas enough breathing room to settle his debt at the bank, and buy feed for the winter, and begin, for the first time in years, to plan for a future that extended beyond the next payment date. Ruth became the bookkeeper. It started as a joke. Silas had said it once, weeks ago, that he needed someone to handle the numbers, because his arithmetic was as unreliable as his father's promises. Ruth had taken it seriously. She took everything seriously. She went through the ranch ledgers page by page and found what she expected to find. Years of overcharges, inflated fees, manipulated accounts, the slow, methodical bleeding that Mercer had perfected. She sat on the new porch beside Silas one evening with the book spread between them and the last light of a September sun turning the valley gold. "You are overpaying for feed grain," she said. "I can negotiate that down 20%. Silas looked at her. "You want to negotiate with Earl Tucker. That man has been cheating ranchers since before I was born. I convinced a federal judge to issue an emergency protection order. I faced down a United States Marshal with a loaded pistol. I stood in a room with my own father and told him to his face that his empire was built on graves." She paused. "Earl Tucker sells oats." They looked at each other, and for the first time both of them laughed. Not a small, cautious laugh. The kind that starts in the belly and rises and breaks free and fills the air with the sound of 2 people who have been carrying impossible weight, discovering that the absurdity of being alive is somehow the funniest and most beautiful thing in the world. They sat on the porch and laughed about oats while the sun went down, and the new house stood behind them smelling of pine and hope, and the particular stubbornness of people who refused to quit. That night, Silas hung his coat on a nail by the front door. Ruth noticed that the pocket where the bottle used to live was flat, empty, had been for weeks now. She did not mention it. Some victories are private, and saying them aloud risks turning them into promises, and promises are fragile things. Better to let the empty pocket speak for itself. A letter arrived 2 days later. Not from a lawyer, not from the court, from the territorial prison in Deer Lodge. Ruth's name on the envelope in handwriting she recognized, her father's hand. Precise, controlled. Even from a cell, he wrote, like a man who believed the presentation of order was the same as order itself. She opened it at the kitchen table while Silas was outside with the horses. 2 sentences. The book I used to read you was called The Girl in the Woods. You always asked me to read the ending twice. Ruth sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. She did not cry. She did not tear it up. She thought about a room with firelight and a man's voice reading slowly and a girl in a nightgown curled against her father's arm asking for the last page again, because the ending was happy, and happy endings were worth hearing more than once. That girl was gone. The father who read to her was gone too, replaced or perhaps revealed by the man who sat in a cell in Deer Lodge waiting for a trial that would determine whether he spent the rest of his life behind stone walls. Ruth folded the letter. She opened the tin box that sat on the shelf beside the kitchen window, the box that had held Margaret Kane's journal before the fire. It was empty now. She placed the letter inside and closed the lid. She did not write back. Maybe she would someday. Maybe not. But she kept the letter. Because the girl who loved that book was still alive somewhere inside her. And killing that girl off completely would mean her father had won after all. The next morning, Ruth woke before dawn. Old habit. 7 months of sleeping in enemy territory had wired her body to wake in darkness and listen for danger. But this morning, when her eyes opened and the room was black and quiet, she did not count the exits. She lay still and listened. Wind through grass. A sound so ordinary it was almost invisible, but she heard it now, the way a person hears music after a long silence. Horses breathing in the new barn. Deep and rhythmic, the sound of animals that were fed and warm and not afraid. Silas turning over in the next room. The creak of the bed frame. A mumbled word she could not make out. Separate rooms. They were at the beginning of something, not the middle. There was time. She got up, pulled on her boots. The same boots she had been wearing since Ida Polk gave them to her on the trail. Worn. Scuffed. They fit now. They had not fit at first, but her feet had shaped to them, and they had shaped to her feet, and that was how belonging worked, she thought. Not a perfect match from the start. A gradual wearing in until the thing and the person became part of each other. She stepped onto the porch. The air was cold. September in Montana meant the first bite of what was coming. Frost on the fence posts, steam rising off the water trough. The sky was dark in the west and pale in the east, and the line between them was the color of a bruise healing. She walked to the barn, the new barn, smaller than the one that burned. Holt and Silas had built it in a week. The wood was pale and the nails were bright, and it smelled like sawdust and hay and the beginning of a season rather than the end of one. She took the oil can from the shelf, tilted it, applied 3 drops to the door hinge, worked the door back and forth. It swung smooth and silent. No creak, no rust, no resistance. The first thing she had noticed about this ranch, the very first morning, was the rusted hinge on the barn door. She had told Silas it would break within the week. Now the barn was new, and the hinge was new, and she was the one who kept it oiled, and she was the one who opened and closed it every morning and evening, and she could not have explained to anyone why this small task mattered as much as it did, except that small tasks were the vocabulary of a life that intended to continue. She walked back to the porch, sat down on the step. From inside the house she heard sounds. Footsteps on the plank floor. Water pouring into the kettle. the stove lid lifting with its small iron clang, the sounds of a man making coffee in a kitchen on a cold morning. Ordinary sounds, the kind that happen in every house, in every town, in every territory where people have decided to stay. Ruth reached down and pulled off her boots, set them on the porch beside the door. Neat, toes pointed outward, lined up next to Silas's boots, which were already there from the night before. His were larger and more worn. Hers were smaller and scuffed at the toe. They sat side by side on the raw pine boards of a porch that had been built 3 weeks ago on the foundations of a house that had burned to the ground. 2 pairs of boots, side by side, on the porch of their house. The sun came up over the eastern ridge. It hit the valley floor first, turning the grass from black to gold in a slow wave that moved west across the land. It touched the new fence posts and made them glow. It reached the barn and lit the pale wood until it looked almost white. It found the porch and the woman sitting barefoot on the step, and it warmed her face and her hands and the tops of her feet. Ruth closed her eyes and let it come. She was not safe. Safety was not a thing she believed in anymore, not the way she had believed in it as a child. Safety was a story people told themselves to sleep at night, and she had learned to sleep without it. But she was home, and home was not safety. Home was the choice to stay, to oil the hinges, to check the books, to sit on a porch with bare feet next to a pair of boots that belonged to a man who had said untie her without knowing what it would cost, and who had paid the price and kept paying it because that was what his mother had taught him. Not with words, with the way she lived. Tomorrow, we will find a way, Margaret Kane used to say. Every night, closing the ledger, blowing out the lamp, tomorrow we will find a way. She had not been talking about money. She had been talking about this. About the moment when the losing stops. Not because the fight is over, but because you finally find someone worth fighting beside. About a morning when the sun comes up and the coffee is almost ready and the boots are by the door, and the woman sitting on the porch is not running from anything or toward anything. She is simply here, and here, imperfect and unfinished and held together with new nails and old stubbornness, is home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.